Hello and welcome to another episode of Man vs. Weed, the cannabis review podcast that might be harmful to developing young brains. I'm your host, Tango Hotel Charlie. If you haven't listened before, my wife doesn't use cannabis and I do. She picks the gram and I smoke it all in one joint. Then I take a look at the LP that grew it and do a review on the experience as a whole. So this week I'll be smoking the second of three choices Robin had at the private government cannabis store. Yeah. There was only three. They only had 3 1-gram options in the whole place, so it's not like we had a choice. The strain we're going to look at this week is Sense by Solei, an Aphria brand. Aphria, oh boy, where do I even start with them? Can't I just find an LP that helps kittens or feeds the poor? Aphria is another licensed producer that is so shady it's a struggle to put it in a way that isn't confusing, so bear with me while I attempt to do so. But this shit is messy and confusing by design. These guys aren't dumb and clearly want anyone looking into it to be as confused as fuck. So I'll do my best to put it together in a clear way. So a couple of the main players over at Aphria are two dudes named Vic Neufeld and Andy DiFrancesco. After reading into their dealings, they would appear to be exactly as shady as fuck. So Vic was a CEO and chairman of Aphria back in 2018, and Andy was a key advisor and investor. In fact, Andy was a founding investor of Aphria and its sister company, Scythian Biosciences. There's your first 2 shells in the game. Now, Andy DiFrancesco seems to be the brains of the operation and was responsible for orchestrating the reverse mergers that brought both Aphria and Scythian public. So you have these 2 companies, of which Andy and Vic are chairman and investors of both. Now, Andy also has a private equity firm called the Delvico Group. Through this private equity group, Andy and Vic brokered the LatAm deal. In this deal, they acquired 3 entities, one in Jamaica, called Delvico Caribbean Ventures, one in Colombia, called Delvico Colombia Partners, and in Argentina, an entity called Delvico MMJ International. Notice that they all had Delvico in the name. However, in an effort to conceal the relationship with the investment firm, Vic and Andy changed the names of those entities, days before selling them to Scythian. Red flag. The Jamaican entity became Marigold Acquisitions, the Colombian one became MMJ Colombia Partners, and the Argentine one became MMJ International Investments. But why would they want to distance themselves from the Delvico investment firm? So just to recap the shells in the game so far, we have Aphria at the top. It is managed by Vic, Andy, and the investors. Then you have the sister company, Scythian Biosciences. It's managed by Vic and Andy. And the next 3 shells are Marigold Acquisitions, MMJ Colombia, and MMJ International Partners. Those last 3 were purchased by Scythian using funds from Aphria investors. Now, each of those 3 shells have assets that are presented to Aphria in an inflated manner to make them more enticing. Here's how it works. First, Andy sets up an international company using assets as justification for acquisition. For example, he will claim that the asset has a cannabis license or some grow space or office space. Then they purchase that company using a Canadian shell company under the control of the Delvico Private Investors Group. That shell company agrees to be acquired by the Aphria sister company, Scythian Biosciences, where Vic and Andy hold key inside roles. Scythian then sells its stake in the entity to Aphria at a massive markup. As a result, Andy and his buddies get a bunch of cash and Scythian shares, and Scythian gets a bunch of cash and Aphria shares, and the Aphria shareholders that paid the bill get a bunch of worthless international assets. How worthless? Remember Marigold? That was the Jamaican shell. Scythian bought that entity in mid-September, then flipped it 2 weeks later to Aphria. Aphria bought it for $145 million, netting Scythian $127 million in the deal. $127 million for something they own for 2 weeks. And who profits when Scythian profits? Vic and Andy. So what did Aphria shareholders get for their $145 million investment? Investigators found that what was declared as world-class assets were actually derelict buildings that had been abandoned for years. Marigold's managing director's personal address was even listed as the same abandoned property. Then, after checking Jamaican real estate records, investigators found neither Marigold nor anyone associated with Marigold even owned the property. But that never stopped them from listing it as their own. Another lease they claimed to own in Jamaica was an 800 square foot herb house in collaboration with the Peter Tosh Museum located at Unit 51, Trafalgar Road, Kingston. Upon visiting the location, investigators found that the building only has 50 units. So Unit 51 didn't even exist. Bruh. Another asset was the office space of, and I quote, Jamaica's leading medical cannabis company. However, multiple visits from investigators found the office was dead empty with a paper sign on the front door. That's right, this world-class asset, reported to be the office of Jamaica's leading medical cannabis retailer, was an empty office space with a piece of paper on the door that read Marigold Projects Jamaica Limited. Seems fishy. Next, investigators turned to the team of cutting-edge scientists that Marigold was advertising. First, they spoke to one of Marigold's founding directors, Dr. Janice Fisher. Turns out, Dr. Fisher, a very nice lady, however, she denied ever having any directorship positions at any company, let alone Marigold. Next, investigators looked into Ray Chin. Ray Chin was listed as Marigold's genetic engineer. When investigators visited Mr. Chin's listed address, however, the tenant that did live there had never heard of anyone named Ray Chin living there at all. Then they searched extensively for any signs of a top scientist named Ray Chin through scientific journals and various other sources, but came up completely empty-handed. Finally, one of the biggest reasons investors were sold on the Marigold deal was a local cannabis research and development license. Andy sold Marigold to Aphria investors as though they had this rare R&D license that would make that inflated price tag worth $145 million. But as it turned out, the Jamaican Cannabis Licensing Authority gave out many of these licenses. In fact, all it took to get one was $500, some paperwork, and less than 6 months processing time. So Marigold should have had that license easy, and it wasn't really that big a deal. But wait. As it turns out, according to Jamaican media reports, Marigold didn't even have that license. Turns out, they lied to investors again. So to recap, Vic and Andy bought Marigold shares for $118 US. A few months later, they sold these shares for 18 million Canadian before ultimately flipping it to Aphria for 145 million Canadian dollars. Everyone involved in this inside deal that made money off it was tied to Andy and his Delvico investment group, so the cheap shares were owned by the Delvico group. Then they changed the name to Marigold to mask their inside dealings, and 2 days later sold it to Scythian. The Aphria CEO chairman Vic Neufeld, who was also chairman of Scythian, used Aphria investor money to buy Marigold from Scythian at an inflated price. In this deal, Scythian and Delvico walk away with huge profits, and the Aphria shareholders get derelict buildings and fake scientists. Seems pretty shady, right? But that was just Jamaica. Colombia and Argentina were just as bad. In Argentina, Scythian bought MMJ International from privately held entities, i.e. Delvico investors, Vic and Andy. MMJ had an agreement to buy ABP, an Argentine company that was claimed to be a pharmaceutical import company. ABP was touted to Aphria investors as a strong platform for growth and distribution. Aphria paid roughly $50 million for ABP. Scythia once again pocketed $23 million for an asset they owned for 6 days, while the remaining $27 million went to that private investors group, Andy and his buddies at Delvico. So what did investors actually buy? What they were told was a strong retail platform was actually a small cluttered pharmacy in a rundown section of Buenos Aires. A pharmacy the fraction of the size of a Shoppers Drug Mart or a Pharmasave. What Vic Neufeld, chairman and CEO of Aphria and chairman of Scythian, called one of the nation's leading importers and distributors of pharmaceuticals, was actually a dilapidated building in a mostly residential area, with no signs of operations in what appeared to be an empty warehouse. Sound familiar? Investigators found no signs of employees or any sort of business presence. In the end, they were only able to find 3 people that were actually listed as employees of ABP, and 2 of those were college students, and the third was a guy that lists himself as a soccer player and coach on his Facebook page. Not exactly worth what investors paid for. Furthermore, Scythian released a statement claiming ABP generated an excess of $11 million US from that tiny little pharmacy when in actuality revenues were only about $430,000. Scythian also told investors that a major milestone had taken place and gushed that Argentina's renowned Garrahan Pediatric Hospital had made their first purchase order, an order that would last several years involving a multi-year study of over 100 patients using CBD. This seemed to generate new sales and was proposed to lend Aphria credibility with this acquisition. What a milestone of a purchase order, right? Except one little thing. It didn't happen. Yeah, see, according to the hospital, that massive multi-year purchase was actually a donation. Aphria agreed to give them that cannabis that was to be used in the multi-year study, which is nice, but not how it was sold to Aphria investors who not only foot the bill for the acquisition, but would be paying for the weed being donated to the hospitals. While old Vic and Andy walk away with the $27 million investors paid for Argentine assets through a little shell called Delvico. Andy even bragged about it on social media, hashtagging the post, "Greed is good," and using a picture of himself in that cramped pharmacy. And finally in Colombia, MMJ Colombia was bought by Scythian from Delvico. This time the deal was sold to investors using a letter of intent. Basically, MMJ Colombia was in the process of buying a Colombian cannabis producer. Scythian used that as an excuse to spend more investor money and bought them right up. I'm sure you can see where this is going. That Colombian producer? Another empty office space. There's a rudimentary greenhouse and some empty buildings, but nothing was growing. Oh, and again, not even licensed. Yup, the exact same MO as before. Once again, Andy and the boys over at Delvico walked away with $39 million of Aphria investor cash. These guys did it all. Insider self-dealing, lying about assets, shuffling them to spouses' names, market manipulation, pump and dumps, you name it. Real culture vulture shit. Do you really think they're going to provide quality cannabis at reasonable prices? Of course not. Investigators spoke to employees of Aphria, and they reported a quantity over quality business model, with a lot of inexperienced people that didn't really know what they were doing. Employees admitted that this led to Health Canada audit failures for bug infestations and mold. At the time, it was reported that the Leamington, Ontario facility had bug infestations in every single grow room that contained plants. Another source reported huge customer turnover that was caused by high prices and low-quality cannabis in both Colombian and Canadian markets. For years, Aphria failed to generate a positive cash flow. Low-quality, low-budget operations that were not meeting the demands of the Canadian cannabis consumers. This caused sales and stocks to plummet, but investor negative cash flow at Aphria continued to prop them up until 2020. That's when Tilray took the bait and moved to merge with Aphria. That merger completed in May of 2021. Aphria is now Tilray. Yikes. So once again, you're like, Tango, what the fuck do I need to know about all these shady assholes for? And again, I say this is why legal weed costs so much, and sucks so fucking bad. The government tells you that the black market is where you find the shady criminals selling you dangerous low-quality cannabis, when the truth is these corporate government legal producers are more shady than anyone you ever dealt with on the legacy market. So after all that, I could have definitely used the joint. Now this week I did another wake and bake to give the sample every opportunity to impress me. Now again, it was Sense by Solei. Solei is so nice and peaceful, isn't it? Definitely doesn't make you think of all those shady backroom deals I just told you about. Nope, Solei is all about that healthy yoga vibe. Or they would be if Health Canada didn't give them shit for it, and they had to take all that down. Yup, sorry, any allusion to health benefits of cannabis is strictly illegal in Canada. Anyway, this gram of Sense came in a Ziploc pouch, and that's fucking great because fuck plastic jars. It is a 19% THC hybrid strain with high levels of myrcene and limonene. Then I read the package date. October 2020. That's almost 8 months ago. But I got a deal for old product, right? Wrong. You see, in accordance with Health Canada regulation, cannabis has no expiry date. So they can just sell you old degraded weed at full price, and you should just be fucking happy it's legal. When I cracked the Ziploc, the Terp Ghost was dead. Even it had long since expired. I guess Health Canada doesn't regulate the lifespan of Terp Ghosts. When I dumped the Sense out of the bag, I was surprised to find it was one good-sized bud. instead of the usual pea bud and crumbles. In my shock and amazement, I posted pictures of it on the hashtag #ManVersusWeed on Twitter. You can find those pics and everything Man-versus-Weed at that hashtag. However, my excitement quickly turned sour when I felt how dry it was. This shit was drier than my sense of humor. I threw it on the scale and sure enough it weighed less than a gram. I put it up to my nose and there was nothing but a faint cannabis aroma. Again, like a bag that once contained actual weed. Under the microscope, or should I say trichroscope, the stalks were fairly intact and had actual heads. Which, after the last few samples, is nice to see. However, many of them were amber, indicating a late harvest. The bud itself was dark green with reddish-brown hairs, and when I squished it in my fingertips, it turned to absolute dust with zero effort. Breaking it open didn't release any hiding terp hostages, and it wasn't sticky in the slightest. Just looking at it after I broke it up, I could tell it was going to be a sad small joint. Being so dusty and underweight, I was right. It barely filled the paper. Just a sad pinner of a joint. Surprisingly, it burned okay, aside from being relit once. The smoke was quite harsh on the throat thanks to the sawdust-like dryness of the sample. There was little to no flavor. But while it didn't taste good, at least it didn't taste bad, and that is a low bar I'll take. The ash burned a fairly light gray color, however. It had a yellowish-brown tinge to it. I couldn't even tell you what causes that, but it's not the first time I've seen it. Since it was so small and dry, it burned quickly and the high was very mild. Even after a wake and bake, I still wanted to smoke a real joint after. So a $300 ounce of dry, low quality, no terpene having shitty weed that puts money in the pockets of the rich asshole culture vultures. Would I buy this again? I think I would have to be completely senseless to ever buy this on purpose. Sorry, Aphria, or Tilray, or whatever the fuck you call yourself now, but that's a resounding no for me. Thanks again for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at StreetVillain, and if you'd like to send me an email, it's manversusweedthc@gmail.com. Until next time, stay high as fuck and free the weed.